Hello, today is Wednesday, May 1st, and welcome to episode 330 of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you quickly up to speed 3 times a week on the national security and foreign policy debates shaking up America. I'm NSI's founder and executive director, Jamil Jaffer. I'm joined today by three NSI senior fellows, Morgan Vina, Bishop Garrison, and Lester Munson. So today, folks, we are talking about the Israel-Hamas War and the role of courts and campuses in that war. What do I mean? I mean, we're talking about the protests going on across the country here in the United States in favor of, well, it's unclear, in favor of the Palestinian cause, in favor of Hamas. Some are on Hamas's side, some are supporting the Palestinians, but there are protests against the way that Israel is conducting the war here in the United States, including well over 100 arrests last night at Columbia University after students took over a building on campus. Riot police went in late at night and extracted a number of those students, arresting a bunch of them. In addition, there are rumors that the ICC, the International Criminal Court, of which the United States is not a member, we did sign the Rome Treaty and then ultimately walked away from it. The ICC is apparently getting ready to issue arrest warrants for senior Israeli leadership. Congress has gotten in the mix, threatening the ICC with action from the United States. Unclear what that action might be, but there have been threats made. So off we go. Morgan Vina, what do we make of what's going on courts and campuses and the current conflict in the Middle East? A lot of alliteration there.
Yep. So two very important topics that are interrelated here. Let's start with the protests first. On college campuses, it's one thing to, express your freedom of speech. It's quite another to threaten the security of your fellow students and call for, genocide against, the Jewish people. We've seen a number of disturbing incidents across college campuses across the country in which Jewish students, quite frankly, are having their safety and security threatened and by these protesters. I think it's worth noting, too, that it's not just college students that are on these campuses. It is a number of activists, particularly in the Palestinian community, with ties to terrorist organizations abroad, including the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. We saw the wife of an activist and frankly terrorist funder for the PIJ on Columbia's campus, about 2 weeks ago. These are really worrying trends here, and it really does raise the question about foreign influence on college campuses and stirring up that anti-Semitic hatred of Jews. I will note, too, that I think there is a sort of a counterterrorism element here amongst our Gen Z populations. They don't really have any sort of memory of 9/11 and the absolute horror that not only New York City but the country was put through when Al-Qaeda attacked the United States. And so I do think that there is this complete just this ignorance, quite frankly, amongst college campuses that does exist. Quickly turning to the ICC, my theory is that the Israelis got word of the prosecutor's intentions here and deliberately went to the United States for assistance here. Look, ICC investigations against and arrest warrants against Israelis, that this has been under discussion since 2014. So this is not necessarily new, but I think there is significant cause for concern here. I would note that if the ICC did pull this, I mean, that is a Rubicon that they are crossing here, and there's no real place to escalate from there. Clearly, we've got action being taken on Capitol Hill. I think there are a number of, options being considered, anything from, sanctions on, ICC officials. We could potentially put pressure on U.S. bilateral partners not to enforce the arrest warrants if they were issued. Then, of course, we could also withhold money from the Palestinians under an Obama era sort of appropriations provision. So I will leave it at that.
Well, so Bishop, I want to talk to you a little bit about this campus issue because, it strikes me. Look, there's obviously a line between being critical of the Israeli government and its policies, whatever you might think about how the war is being carried out or the justification for it, there's a difference between that and anti-Semitism, right? At the same time, whether it's the college students on these college campuses or the rabble rousers that Morgan's talking about that have gathered around the Columbia campus, I mean, there is a legitimate worry, isn't there, that we're sort of seeing New York City being transformed essentially into Charlottesville. I mean, is that something we should be worried about happening here? Because it feels a little bit like that.
I don't know if we're going to go that far on it. Look, I think it would be remiss if we didn't note that there are some students and individuals from the Jewish faith, from the Jewish community, that are part of these protests too, because they want to have a voice in this moment, in this period. We're talking about a humanitarian crisis that's currently engulfed the globe when you talk about Gaza and Israel, Hamas, or Israel-Palestine. And I think it's not fair to completely say this is all just activists and this is all just an effort towards anti-Semitic behavior. Some of this is definitely focused on the idea that these students, these individuals, want to push back on some of, frankly, in some parts of this, the brutality we've seen from the IDF. To that point, I think it is fair to say that we've also seen many parts of these protests go too far. They have crossed the line. We've seen, particularly with Columbia, we've seen individuals breaking into buildings, tearing things apart, attacking people. That is not a part of a peaceful protest. But I think this began, frankly, from an area of true a moral imperative to try to fight back on some of the things we were seeing coming out of Israel in the way the Palestine people were treated. I do believe that there is absolutely a point to be made that you're seeing more and more people from outside of these college communities that are coming in and that are basically bringing the temperature of the situation up higher. And they do have some nefarious means, methods, and intent in their activity. But I don't think it is as cut and dry as we're trying to make it here. It's a very complex situation. I just want all of us to just make that point.
Well, Les, you're one for complexity and nuance. So talk about what you see going on here, because from where I sit, look, there's no doubt that you can have sympathy for the Palestinian people and for their plight. You can have sympathy for the 1,200 Israelis and their families who were killed in a terrorist attack that was 12 times the size of, on a population adjusted basis, of what happened to the U.S. on 9/11. There's a lot of blame, a lot of sympathy to go around. But what's happening in college campuses, there's political protests, to be sure. There's also a lot of threats of violence and talks about, I find it interesting how one side talks about genocide being committed on one group of people, but then calls for the destruction of an entire another population, right? I mean, there's a little bit of irony here going on that I think, can't go unnoticed. Les, what should we make of all this? And what I want to know from you, interestingly, is will we actually see a change in either U.S. government or Israeli policy as a result of the pressure from campuses and courts?
So I actually went to visit a protest at a campus this weekend.
You did?
At my alma mater, where it was very peaceful, and there were about 100 students. I think they were all students out protesting. They put up some tents. I think REI is doing quite well with these campus protests because they were all very expensive tents. They look pretty nice.
Just to be clear, Les, you're talking about the University of Chicago, right?
That's correct.
Where fun goes to die and where hell does freeze over.
To die, although that's less true than it used to be. It's actually a lovely campus, and the kids seem way more well-rounded than when I was there. But the couple of thoughts. One, my sample size of Gen Zers I have a focus group of 2 of them that I talk to quite frequently.
You live in your
Neither
household.
one of them is very impressed with these protests so far and think that they're kind of ridiculous. I will say there's a risk. I think I agree with Bishop a little bit here. I think there's a risk for some of these folks that what they think is a protest for peace is actually a pro-war protest. And a lot of these, the rhetoric coming out that is pro-Hamas and pro more extreme positions of the Palestinians is actually advocacy for war. So a lot of these kids are accidentally finding themselves advocating for war. I do think there's going to be a political issue, maybe for both parties, but particularly for Democrats coming into the summer. The convention's going to be in Chicago. The Democrats' convention is going to be in Chicago in mid-August. if these campus protests get shut down now, are they going to pop back up there? What's that going to look like? There's of course a whole history there of some really interesting advocacy and things like that. As far
in
as
Chicago in particular, at the
Chicago
Democratic
in
Convention.
particular, exactly. And then as far as the International Criminal Court goes, thank God for the U.S. Senate never agreeing to that treaty. I think I worry that some of our presidents would have gone ahead and stumbled into that if it were totally up to them. So thank goodness for the balance of power and checks and balances in our government. Whoever came up with that idea was pretty sharp.
So Morgan, I want to give you one more shot at this, and Bishop, I'm going to give you the last word. So Morgan, what's your thinking here? Are we going to see any change in policy? I haven't heard that yet from anybody that we're going to see a change in policy as a result of the increasing pressure from these campuses and courts.
Well, look, I mean, I think the Biden administration has rightfully been critical of these protests. I think that they could be a little bit more forceful with condemning the blatant anti-Semitism that we are seeing amongst many of these protesters. I will say, though, that as I've said before, look, we've got an election coming up in November. President Biden is acutely aware that he's got a problem with the Muslim American community
on both sides.
Right. And it's interesting too, because many of the American Jewish population votes Democrat, right?
Yeah.
So I think he's
not
got
for long.
Right. I mean, I think he's got a major political challenge here and a needle that he has to thread. I think Michigan in particular is looking pretty bad for him. We saw the uncommitted vote, earlier this year, and I think that was a bit of a wake up call. So I think he's going to be trying to keep it cool here without trying to inflame both sides, so to speak. But ultimately, I think it is disappointing that this administration hasn't come out more forcefully and condemned these protests and called for them to be neutralized.
Well, Bishop, you got the last word here. You served in the Department of Defense in this administration. What is President Biden and the White House thinking, and with the elections coming up?
Well, there's a needle to thread here, and I do think Morgan kind of hit the nail on the head here in terms of the Michigan uncommitted vote versus what the Jewish community and population have long been for generations strong backers of the Democratic Party in New York. So particularly Michigan, I'm actually not doom and gloom on this as much. I think that they kind of had that uncommitted vote as just a little bit of a push to say, don't forget that we're here. I think as we get closer to the election, you're going to see particularly a lot of progressives, a lot of Dems that go, hey, we're not going to do much better with the other guy on the other side. We know what that is about. At least we have a voice here and can push back on certain policies if we were to stick with Biden. So I think at the end of the day, that's what you're going to see. The other part of this is the overall atmospherics, though. What we're seeing on these college campuses in no small part is a bit of a paradigm shift in this conversation. We're seeing more and more people, young people, that are also a large 18 to 25, a large part of the demographic that we need to turn out to vote on the Dem side. We're seeing them push back on these policies and what parts of Israel, the Israeli government is doing in the region. That is not to say that automatically all of these kids are going to be pro-Hamas and completely against the Israeli people. But I do think, to Lester's earlier point, there's a bit of a mix and some confusion on what some of the rhetoric means that they are utilizing in some of the actions that they're taking on. And I don't know if they fully appreciate how it might play out from an optics perspective. Lastly, this is one of those issues at the end of the day that looks to bring the far left and the far right together on certain aspects of it. This is definitely a horseshoe issue of sorts that we're continuing to see. And until we have an honest dialogue on the complexities of this as a country, as a society, we're going to continue to see this kind of play out, unfortunately, the way it is right now.
All right. Well, there we go. Well, this is going to play out definitely over the next few weeks and months, and we got an election coming up in November. So, folks, that's a wrap. Thanks so much to Devlin Burney, Claude Jennings, and the NSI staff for the help in producing today's episode. Join us again on Friday, May 3rd, for another episode of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you smart fast on the national security and foreign policy debates shaking up America. Fault Lines is now on YouTube, so check out our channel for a video of today's episode. See Bishop and Morgan and Lester's smiling faces and mine And if you like what you heard or saw, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe.